Story 1. So, here's the thing. I thought I had everything figured out when I bought that small starter home. It was during the housing market crash, and the timing was perfect. Prices were low, and I was pretty proud of myself for doing it all on my own. I lived there for almost a decade, and it wasn't a bad place. Eventually, life moved on. I met my now husband, and we decided to buy a bigger house. That's when my parents came into the picture. They've always had issues with money, particularly with mortgages. They actually had a foreclosure in the past, and honestly, they weren't going to qualify for a mortgage on their own. My dad's retired, and my mom has never really worked, so their income isn't great. But when they saw my little house sitting there, empty, they wanted in. At first, I wasn't against the idea. The house was small, and they kept going on about how it was easy to maintain, perfect for their needs. It wasn't like I was going to make a lot renting it out, but I figured I could help them out. Then they got an inheritance over 6 figures and came to me with a plan. They'd pay off the remaining mortgage, about $50K, and in exchange, I'd let them rent the place for practically nothing. We put everything down in writing. We had a lease drawn up, notarized, all that official stuff. It clearly stated that the inheritance money was a prepayment of rent, and that from then on, they'd only need to cover the taxes and insurance. It wasn't a bad deal for them at all $350 a month for a whole house with a big yard. That rent would only go up if taxes or insurance increased. They'd basically lucked out, considering I could easily get $2K a month in rent if I opened it up to the market. I wasn't making a single penny off this deal, but hey, they're my parents. Everything was fine for a while. They lived in the house, made some cosmetic changes like planting a garden, and all seemed peaceful. Until it wasn't. A couple of weeks ago, I let them know the rent was going to increase by a grand total of $3. Yes, $3 freaking dollars. It was just a slight bump because the insurance had gone up, and I wasn't about to cover that for them. I thought this was such a non-issue that I didn't even brace myself for what came next. My mom absolutely lost her mind, like totally flipped out. She called me a money-hungry bitch, said I was taking advantage of them and acting like a landlord from hell. Then, in a rage, she claimed she was going to rip out everything she'd added to the house, the garden, the flowers, whatever. She went on about how I owed her, how it was her asterisk house now, and that I couldn't kick her out because of that. I reminded her that we had a notarized lease. You know, that legally binding piece of paper that said they were tenants and I was the only person on the deed. But she didn't want to hear any of it. She was convinced that the insurance hadn't gone up in a decade. Newsflash. Look at lumber prices, and I was trying to trick her into paying for my own personal homeowner's insurance. She kept ranting that if this went to court, a judge would just hand her the house on a silver platter. At this point, my dad was just standing there, not saying a word. Typical. He's never been one to stand up to her, even when she's clearly wrong. But suddenly, he decides to pipe up and demand to see the bills. Like he thought I was ripping them off or something. Mind you, this house is commutable to Manhattan. A studio apartment in that area cost $1,500 easy. And here they are, living in a whole house with a yard for their dog for a fraction of that. I sent them copies of the taxes and insurance with their address on them, showing everything clearly. I even mentioned that I was charging them discounted taxes because I pay early to get the discount. All they had to do was add the numbers and divide by 12 to see that I wasn't making anything up. I told my mom to talk to a lawyer if she didn't believe me. Let a professional explain how leases work and set her straight. Here's the kicker. I guess my dad, after seeing the bills, realized that I wasn't scamming them. He must have sided with me behind the scenes because now my mom's filing for divorce. Yep, that's right, over $3. She's divorcing him because he wouldn't back her crazy argument. I feel bad for my dad in all of this. He's not perfect, but I never expected things to blow up like this. I didn't think a measly $3 rent increase would unravel their whole marriage, but here we are. Part of me wonders if this has been brewing for a while and the house stuff was just the tipping point. Still, it feels pretty insane that all of this is happening over something so trivial. Now, I'm stuck in the middle of this mess. my mom's threatening to rip out the garden, my dad's trying to salvage what's left of their relationship, and I'm just here, wondering if I should have let them rent in the first place. If I just rented the house to a random stranger, I'd be $2K richer every month and wouldn't be dealing with any of this drama. But hindsight's 20/20, I guess. Anyway, that's where I'm at right now. I don't know what's gonna happen next, but I do know one thing. No matter what, I'm not budging on that $3. Story 2. I first got to college my freshman year and met the dorm leader raw at most schools. Like most colleges, the dorm leader was the upperclassman that lived in the dorms and monitored the freshman halls. My dorm leader's name was Julio, fake name BTW, and at first, he seemed like a nice dude that minded his own business. He talked about how he would stay out of everyone's business if we would stay out of his. Also, he tried to be the cool dorm leader and always mentioned to me about how he drank tons of alcohol his freshman year in the dorms. He gave off the impression he really didn't care if we ever drank in our dorm rooms, but to just keep it on the low if we did. I really didn't drink much at all, but I appreciated the fact he seemed pretty normal and didn't try to rat on kids. During the last week of October of my freshman year of college, I had one of the hardest weeks of my academic career. I was a biochemistry major taking some pretty tough classes and had 3 exams that week. At the end of the week, a friend I had recently made down the hall invited me to his dorm room to watch an upcoming NBA game. As we were watching the game, he had a bottle of vodka and gave some to the guys in the dorm. Being a naive and stupid freshman kid just trying to make some friends, I took 1 shot of vodka and continued to watch the game. As we're watching the game, one of the guys in the dorm spills a bottle of soda and rushes to the bathroom to grab some paper towels. As he walked out of the dorm room, Julio walked by and noticed the bottle of vodka. He laughed and said something of the sort of, "I remember when I was a freshman, haha, just try and keep it down." We thanked him and told him to have a good night. It seemed like a normal conversation and nothing out of the ordinary. 30 minutes later, we heard a knock on the door and 2 policemen showed up with breathalyzers. They told us they had received a complaint from Julio about underage drinking and a party being thrown in the dorm room. Remember, it was 3 guys watching a Lakers game on a Thursday night at 8 p.m. I ended up getting a minor in consumption charge for blowing a .02, had to do 20 hours community service, a reflection journal, and appear to the Judicial Affairs Center at my college about my supposed drinking problem. I'm not blaming the officer for giving me a ticket, but I was pretty upset that Julio, who always talked about getting drunk during his freshman year in the dorm, called the police right after he essentially gave us the okay for the night. A few weeks later, I saw Julio and straight up asked him why he decided to rat me out. Specifically, I asked why he didn't just tell me to head back to my dorm if he had a problem with the alcohol instead of calling the police right after our conversation. He responds word for word with, "You made a decision and had to suffer the consequences of that decision." After that incident, I never really talked to him, but he always tried to be buddy-buddy when he saw me in the hallway. Anyway, I eventually left the dorms and moved off campus for my sophomore year. I had decided to rush a fraternity my freshman year and ended up meeting some really nice guys. I have never been the fraternity type, but I went to a smaller college where fraternities are a lot different than most places. During the second semester of my sophomore year, my fraternity was taking a new pledge class. One day I received a text from Julio saying, "One of the guys pledging your fraternity has been caught dealing alcohol to another freshman in the dorms. I thought I would let you know." Turns out Julio was the dorm leader for a freshman pledging my fraternity and ratted him out to Judicial Affairs as well. Thinking the term dealing alcohol was the lamest funniest thing I have ever heard, I sent that to our fraternity GroupMe and everyone laughed about it. About a week later, that kid pledging our fraternity came up to me asking about the message I received from Julio. Essentially, a pretty similar thing happened to him like what happened to me. Julio found out he had given another kid in the dorm a bottle of wine and reported it to the police. This kid ended up getting a minor in possession and had to speak with Judicial Affairs. This is where the story gets hilarious. In his meeting with Judicial Affairs, The kid pledging our fraternity told them that his dorm leader Julio was now a senior at this point had texted me about the charges pending against him. Apparently, it's a huge violation to discuss pending charges against a freshman in your dorm to a third party. The judicial affairs guy told him that if he could prove Julio was discussing this charge with a third party aka me, he would receive severe sanctions. Basically, if I sent that text to the judicial affairs people, Julio would be in big trouble, so ended up sending them that text that night. After that, I didn't hear anything about what happened to Julio and had honestly forgotten about it. However, nearing the end of the school year in my sophomore year, I saw Julio at the dining hall and came up to speak to me. He tells me a story about how he knows I was the one who ratted him to judicial affairs, how he ended up getting fired from his dorm leader position, lost the scholarship money his dorm leader job provided him, and overall how bad his life has been since he got fired. After going through his entire sob story, he asked me, "Why did you do that? This could have been handled completely differently. I didn't have to get fired and I could have kept my scholarship money." I looked him dead in the eye for what seemed like 30 seconds and said, "Julio, you made a decision and had to suffer the consequences of that decision." Story 3. With that being said, allow me to start. My parents are divorced and have been for almost 7 years now. They split due to Dad not being home for his kids at all. He's self-employed and chooses his own hours to work. However, he'd work every day of the week, waking up at 10 after me and my sisters went to school and getting home at 8 or 9 p.m., when we were already preparing for bed. So when I say my mom was a single parent despite being married, I mean it. She's my idol, and I look up to her so much. Anyway, after the divorce, the court arranged that there would be equal custody over us 3 kids. We would stay with Mom for 1 week, then Dad the next, and so on. But it wasn't true equal custody. Due to the hours my dad chose to work, us kids had to walk back to Mom's new flat, where we would be fed, she'd help us with homework, etc. Then, at 9 p.m., Dad would come collect us, and we'd go straight back to his house to sleep. Weekends would just be us kids in his house alone all day while he worked. But at night, that was when it got worse. See, my dad is incredibly insecure. As such, he insisted I leave my phone downstairs to charge on the nights, so that you aren't on it all hours of the night. He promised me he wouldn't go through it, as he A. had no right to, and B. Mom paid for the phone anyway. But that very first night, I woke up suddenly at 3 a.m. to my bedroom door being actually kicked inwards, and my dad screaming at me, my phone in his hand. Apparently he wasn't happy that I had been messaging my friend about the sleeping situation. He then told me he didn't want me in his sight. I'd like to say this is where the story ends, but I'm still typing. This would happen every other night when I would sleep at his house, and my sisters were traumatized by the yelling and screaming they would hear each night. He decided to look at my phone. Each morning, my phone would be unlocked, with gallery, messages, contacts, and WhatsApp open. It became the norm for me to delete message threads and just tell him nobody spoke to me. But that instead aroused his suspicion that I was lying to him. I couldn't change my phone's PIN because he'd ask for it in case of emergencies. It eventually drew to the point where after years of abuse, I had enough. In January 2020, I gave up on it all and decided to not continue living. I was caught by the police, arrested, and taken to a ward where the first person I saw was my dear sweet mom, who told me that I didn't have to live with my dad anymore. Both the lowest and highest point in my life. Fast forward to a few months ago. My younger sister decided she wants to live with Mom permanently like I do. Dad doesn't take this news lightly. He insists on a friendly talk with me and my sister in a public park so we can arrange what she wants. Surprise, surprise, I was invited for alternate reasons. Dad begins yelling at me about how bad of a son I've been to him as a dad that's done nothing but his absolute best to raise me. So I remind him of the abuse. It's how my dad raised me. There's nothing wrong with bollocking every now and then. I stand up for myself this time. I yell back at him about how he dares sit there and demand respect and appreciation for nothing but allowing your children to sleep in your house and traumatizing your son because you feel insecure. He demands I respect him, and I tell him I never have. That breaks him. He begins crying about how he's felt and how he's been contemplating not continuing living. I begin to soften, but as I do he says, "And it's all because of how you kids have treated me." I tell him he's a scumbag and a jerk for trying to guilt-trip his kids by threatening such an act, that my sister won't be staying with him, and we leave. When he comes to pick up our youngest sister, he doesn't speak to us, and he doesn't acknowledge we exist. My sister and I are finally safe. Edit. For those of you that asked, my youngest sister still goes to my dad's house regularly, and is the golden child of the bunch. She looks the most like him, and is the most impressionable. Regarding how she's treated, we ask her every time she comes home from school how it was at her dad's house, and thankfully nothing has happened. She isn't shaky or hesitant in her responses, and she seems to genuinely enjoy being there, just as much as she enjoys living here. In terms of child support and the legal side of things, my mum took him to court a few weeks ago because he hadn't been paying any of the money he owed for both my sisters. I'm 18, legally exempt. However, it's been discovered he's been committing tax fraud for years, due to his job being cash in hand. So he's on his way to staying behind bars for no less than a couple of years. Story 4. I had always enjoyed my quiet life in the suburbs. The peaceful atmosphere and the friendly neighbors made it the perfect place to retire. However, my peaceful life was about to be disrupted by one entitled neighbor. It all started when a new family moved in next door. They were loud, obnoxious, and extremely entitled. The mother, in particular, was a real piece of work. She would constantly demand that the entire neighborhood cater to her every whim. One day, I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the sun when I saw her approaching. She marched up to me, her eyes blazing with fury. "Excuse me, but I need to borrow your lawnmower," she said, not even bothering to introduce herself. I was taken aback. I barely knew this woman, and she was already demanding to use my property. "Sorry, I can't lend it to you. I need it for my own lawn," I replied politely. "Well, I don't care. I need it now, and you're going to give it to me," she snapped. I was shocked by her audacity, but I stood my ground. "I'm sorry, but no, I can't let you use it. You'll have to find another way." That's when she lost it. She started screaming at me, calling me all sorts of names and accusing me of being selfish. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. Eventually, she stormed off, still shouting insults at me. I thought that was the end of it, but it was just the beginning. From that day on, she would make my life a living hell. She would blast loud music at all hours of the day and night, park her car in my driveway, and even throw trash into my yard. One day, I had had enough. I decided to confront her and put an end to her entitled behavior. I marched over to her house, determined to give her a piece of my mind. When I got there, I found her sitting on her porch, sipping a cocktail. She looked up at me and smirked. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Yes, you can. I want you to stop harassing me and my family," I said, trying to keep my cool. "Harassing you? I'm not doing anything of the sort. You're just being paranoid," she replied, taking a sip of her drink. "That's not true, and you know it. You've been parking in my driveway and throwing trash into my yard." "That's harassment," I said, my anger starting to boil. She just laughed. "Oh, please. You're making a big deal out of nothing. It's not like I'm hurting anyone." I had had enough of her smug attitude. I decided to give her a taste of her own medicine. "You know what? You're right. It's not like you're hurting anyone. So, I guess it's okay if I park in your driveway and throw trash into your yard, right?" She looked shocked, but I could see the anger building in her eyes. "How dare you? You're not allowed to do that," she shouted, standing up from her chair. "Why not? If it's okay for you to do it, then it's okay for me too, right?" I said, enjoying the look of frustration on her face. That's when she lost it. She charged at me, fists clenched and ready to strike. I backed away, trying to avoid her blows. Thankfully, a neighbor had called the police, and they arrived just in time to break up the fight. The entitled mother was arrested for assault, and I never heard from her again. The neighborhood was peaceful once more, and I could finally relax on my porch without any disturbances. I later found out that the entitled mother had a long history of entitled behavior. She had been banned from several stores in the area for causing scenes and demanding special treatment. Her husband was just as bad, constantly yelling at the kids and berating anyone who crossed him. Another story for another time. In any case, I learned a valuable lesson from that experience. I learned that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself and not let others walk all over you. It may be uncomfortable and even scary, but it's necessary to maintain your dignity and self-respect. Story 5. Last year, a woman named Karen, who was 70 years old, reached out to me on Facebook. She asked if I could take care of her cats while she and her husband embarked on a campervan journey across Europe. Karen claimed to have become wealthy through bitcoins and didn't want to subject her newly rescued cats to the stress of constant travel. These feline companions had been in a cattery, under the care of someone else, for the past 5 months. When Karen delivered the cats to our farm, she made quite a fuss. Despite having sent her photos of the enclosure we had prepared for them, she vehemently refused to place the cats there during their initial adjustment period. According to her, everything was inadequate. Our dogs were too big, our house was too small, and there were no streetlights as we resided in a rural area. Throughout her visit, I maintained a composed demeanor, successfully settling the cats into their new home while soothing Karen's concerns. She had brought along an abundance of brand new cat accessories, such as tiny harnesses and peculiar outfits, which farm cats certainly don't wear, let alone tutus. She seemed slightly happier when we played along with her eccentricities. Eventually, her husband arrived in their extravagant campervan, resembling the tour bus of a famous rock band. Unexpectedly, Karen's emotional intensity increased dramatically. She began wailing and crying for her beloved feline babies, and her husband dutifully attended to her, wiping away tears with his hands and providing unwavering support as she partially collapsed onto our driveway. After some time, they departed, and the very next morning, they posted pictures of themselves sipping champagne on the beach. In the following months, we regularly shared updates with Karen, accompanied by adorable pictures of the cats. She consistently expressed gratitude for our care, but never reached out to inquire about their well-being, even during a natural disaster that affected our area. At one point, she had plans to visit the cats, but due to inclement weather, she drove past our remote town without stopping. Whenever we posted pictures of the cats on Facebook, she would always comment about her cats. Last month, I wrote to Karen, informing her that the cats were thriving, but occasionally felt a bit chilly and spent their days lounging on the couch near the fireplace. Her response consisted of instructions on how to keep them warmer and a reminder to ensure I was taking care of them. I replied with a non-committal response. Part 2 refined. Yesterday, I reached out to Karen, informing her that one of the cats had been critically injured after being side-swiped by a tractor. I had stayed up all night, tirelessly trying to keep the cat alive, and she was currently at the veterinary clinic, awaiting life-saving surgery. Suddenly, my phone started ringing incessantly. It was Karen's husband, screaming at me through the line. He demanded to know why I persistently upset Karen with my messages and what I gained from doing so. I attempted to respond, but he wasn't interested in listening. He proceeded to hurl accusations, calling me a sadist, a bully, and an abuser. He asserted that Karen had entrusted us with the cats, so why was I disturbing her when she had moved on? I offered my apologies for any offense caused and tried to explain that I believed Karen would want to know since the cats were originally hers and she cared deeply for them. However, he insisted that I delete Karen's number from my phone, never contact her again, and cease providing updates about the cats. I complied, apologizing once more for any inconvenience caused, and he abruptly hung up. 3 hours later, I received a message from Karen, expressing her distress over the cat's critical condition. She couldn't bear the thought of the cat being ill, and she defended her husband's actions, claiming he was merely trying to shield her from unbearable pain. In response, I voiced my opinion that it was unkind of her husband to shout at me, especially during a pet crisis, when I was simply trying to do the right thing by keeping her informed. However, she responded by calling me a selfish individual and promptly hung up before blocking me. Unfortunately, I didn't get the chance to inform Karen that since the cats were still legally registered under her name, she would be responsible for their expenses. As soon as we arrived at the veterinary clinic, the staff scanned the cat's microchip. We often bring in stray animals, so they know not every animal belongs to us, and it was her name that came up. I anticipate hearing from her when she receives the bank statement for the surgery costs. Meanwhile, the cat is recovering well, and we remain hopeful for her full recovery. She is an integral part of our family, and we certainly haven't moved on from our care and concern for her well-being. Story 6. I'm not sure if this counts as petty revenge. I could have kept silent about something, but instead I let fly and cost someone getting a job. I work at a university that has campuses around several locations in my state in addition to the main campus. The campus where I work is one of the smaller locations. In the year or so before the pandemic hit, the university began implementing some pretty severe budget cuts. Our associate dean saw the writing on the wall and was able to secure a job at a different school in a different state. Next, our campus dean was pushed out. Both of these losses were painful because they were both wonderful people, very approachable, easy to talk to, tried to work with faculty and staff to look for solutions for any problems that popped up. With typical large institution administration logic, now that the dean was gone, it was time to hire a new dean. I'm sure there was new wording in the job description, but it's still stupid IMO. Enter one of our faculty members, who I'll call GP for Giant Prick. GP has a 2/5 rating on Rate My Professor. The rating distribution is 2 votes for awesome, 1 vote for great, 3 votes for good, 1 vote for okay, and 10 votes for awful. A common theme of his reviews is that he was rude, condescending, and unapproachable. I didn't know about these ratings until later when I had my own unpleasant interactions with him. So when he applied for and got the position of interim campus dean, I didn't have any strong feelings one way or the other. This would quickly change. The G in GP doesn't just describe the depth of his prickishness, but also his physical size. He is easily 6'6" inches, 1.98 meters, perhaps a bit more, and probably 350 pounds, 158 kilograms. Not a small guy, and there's nothing about him that is a gentle giant. He is definitely not above using his size to intimidate people, including one of our tiny and sweet English professors, who is maybe 5'1" and 105 pounds, 1.5 m, 47.6 kilograms. As I said, this professor is incredibly sweet and kind, never has a bad word about anyone, is soft-spoken, just an overall pleasant person. I heard from one of the dean's sweet staff that this professor came in one day to discuss something about one of her classes for the upcoming semesters, and he blew up at her. She tried to retreat from his office, but he just stalked after her, yelling at her. The other staff member said, "The bigger and louder he got, the smaller and quieter she got, and she's already so small." This professor never interacted with him again. This is something I learned about later. I'm not as small as that professor, but I'm not much bigger either. Additionally, I am neurospicy and I am sensitive to loud sounds and confrontation, not helped by the fact that my father shook me and screamed at me when I was a colicky baby. It's a wonder he didn't do permanent physical damage. But for at least the next month, any time I heard a male voice, I would start screaming in fear. Add to that a pretty severe anxiety disorder. Well, you can probably tell my interactions with GP weren't going to be pleasant. There were 3 separate times that he bit my head off. One, I admit I wasn't exactly in the right, but the way he handled it was extremely unprofessional. The other 2 cases were things I was 100% in the right about. I don't want to get into specifics because I don't want him to find this post and know who I am, But one thing to know about GP is he likes to do his blowing up in person or on the phone so that there isn't a record of things he says. He stomped to my office once, red-faced and glaring, slammed my door shut, and confronted me. I was in panic mode and used all of my de-escalation techniques to cut off his fuse before he blew. Thank goodness it worked. But by that point, I went from loving my job to looking for other opportunities. Time passed, and the university posted the permanent position for GP's interim position. Thing is, GP was unqualified. He'd never had administrative experience other than this interim role that he got in on as a fluke. I learned later that the search committee wasn't even going to advance his application to the final pool, except a regional higher-up, who for some reason went to bat for GP, basically forced the search committee to add him to the list of finalists. I learned later that this higher-up even gave GP the interview questions in advance and coached him on his answers to try to guarantee him the position. She's one of those administrative suit types who waltzes onto campuses to attend meetings, is typing on her phone throughout the meeting, then breezes off with an air of superiority. Very big fish in a little pond mindset. I wasn't on the search committee, but I was in a group of campus employees who were asked to meet with the search committee to discuss the applicants. There were 4 total, including GP. Applicant 1 was very professional and well-spoken. Applicant 2 was also really good. Applicant 3 struck me as someone who didn't quite understand what his role actually would be with the job. And GP. GP barely put much effort into his answers. The words themselves were okay, but his behavior made it seem like it was all a waste of his time, that he was entitled to the position, etc. In fact, because the pandemic fell under his watch, and we, like everyone else in the world, had to change the way we do things to get through, he literally used the words, "I think I deserve this position." When I learned later that he had received the questions beforehand and had been coached, it made total sense. He truly believed he had this job in the bag because of that higher up. She wasn't even based on our campus, but seemed to think she knew who was the right person for the job. Back to the meeting with the search committee. There were, I think, 3 representatives from the search committee and maybe about 6 of us from the campus there to give our feedback on the presentations the candidates gave. I was prepared to give glowing reviews on applicants 1 and 2, talk about my concerns with applicant 3, and maybe not say anything about GP at all. Remember, I fear confrontation to a fault. Before we really got started, one of the other staff members spoke up. "Before we get started, I believe the person who gets this position needs to have the temperament to yada yada yada." I don't remember what he said after that because my brain latched onto the word temperament. Why had he used that word? Is he perhaps referring to GP? All this time, I thought I was the only one who had had bad interactions with GP. I was probably just misinterpreting it. Or was I? We went around, speaking about the different candidates. As we talked, I started having an anxiety attack because I was slowly coming to the decision that I needed to say something. If I wanted someone other than GP to have this role, then I needed to do what was in my power to make that happen. And the thing that was in my power was to speak my truth. I raised my digital hand, and when I was given the floor, my face flushed with nerves. What I'm going to say? Well, one of the candidates has an advantage because we know him, but perhaps that is a disadvantage as well. And then I began to talk about my concerns with his behavior that I had personally witnessed. To my surprise, I saw every single one of the other attendees from my campus nodding their heads. This was the moment that I realized that the problem with GP was more widespread than I initially thought. After I said a few things, my other colleagues began to tell their own experiences. My anxiety eased as others told their stories. I felt so validated. I thought I'd been allowing a handful of bad experiences with GP coupled with my sensitivity to loud noises, large aggressive men, and confrontation to prejudice me against him. But from what I was hearing from my colleagues changed everything. As you might have guessed, GP did not get the permanent position. What I learned later is that the regional higher-up, the one who had coached GP, tried to throw her weight and authority into forcing the search committee to choose GP. Thankfully, the search committee chair held his ground and finally had to resort to threatening legal action. She backed off, and we have a lovely new dean. GP went back to just being a faculty member. He taught for a year or two, then took a leave of absence. I heard he had trouble with his wife and with alcohol. I don't know for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me. The work environment in the dean's suite relaxed considerably. One day, a month or so after the search committee meeting, the colleague who'd mentioned temperament came to my building. We got to talking, and I told him that his use of that word prompted me to start speaking up about GP's toxic attributes. He said, "I thought you were really brave for starting that conversation." Me? Brave? My heart had been pounding so hard, my chest tightening. All the hallmarks of a growing anxiety attack. I told him I very much appreciated that. Speak the truth, even if your voice shakes.